Kia ora, everybody. My name is Helen Swales, and I have the privilege of welcoming you to today's webinar, and we're calling it a brown paper bag luncheon. So thank you for joining us. As the chair of the Women's Empowerment Principles, it's my privilege to actually introduce you to one of our chairs who looks after the judging of the 7 principles annually. And it's my pleasure to introduce you Marie Thompson. She's a member of one of the 4 parties that collectively, under the umbrella of UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand, that deliver the Women's Empowerment Principles into New Zealand. So Marie is a Zonta member and has been a member since 2009. The Women's Empowerment Principles, and she's been on the committee since 2018. She has been on the White Camellia Awards judging the subcommittee for the past 3 awards and has chaired it for the past 2. So very, very familiar with the topic and the relationship that we have with AUT Work Institute. So Marie has seen many improvements for women in her lifetime, but recognises that there is still progress to be made, with there still being a gender pay gap of around 10%. She is impressed with the steps many organisations are taking to support women in their work. She has grown 1 daughter and wants to work to improve the lives of many women and girls in New Zealand. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Marie Thompson to the floor to introduce our wonderful seminar today. Marie.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's a pleasure to be here. The judges were very impressed with the number of excellent practices many organisations have to support women in the workplace. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Dr. Gail, Pacheco and Douglas Yee from New Zealand Work Research Institute for all the work they've done in relation to the survey and coordinating the results for us and for the subsequent analysis. I'd also like to acknowledge what a pleasure it's been to work with Douglas during the survey. He was so helpful and professional at all times. So we do really appreciate the work of both Gail and Douglas. Thank you. So our speaker initially is Dr. Gail Pacheco, who is a Professor of Economics and Director of the New Zealand Work Institute at Auckland University of Technology. Gail has worked with us on our survey since the beginning of 2016, and we do appreciate that. She is an applied econometrician with a passion for evidence-based analysis, particularly in the labour and health fields. The majority of her research focuses on utilising linked administrative data with particularly strong use of the integrated data infrastructure from Statistics New Zealand to inform policy debate. Gail has extensive experience leading large-scale multi-institutional funded projects, including work for the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, Ministry of Women, Ministry of Education and Human Rights Commission, all with high policy relevance. As principal investigator, she's been awarded close to $7 million in competitive external grants since 2015, including funding from Health Research Council and the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Endeavour Fund. Evidence of the policy impact of her work is highlighted by being the 2018 recipient of the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research Economics Award that recognises outstanding contributions to the advancement of economics and its application to New Zealand, which are relevance to the economic welfare of New Zealand and likely to be of long-term lasting importance in New Zealand. In 2019, she was appointed as a commissioner of the Productivity Commission and also received the Auckland University of Technology Medal, which is AUT's top award for her research, scholarship, and application of integrated data to help inform social policy and wellbeing. So very impressive. Dr. Pacheco, I'll hand it over to you.
Wow, that's a lot to live up to. That's an impressive introduction. Thank you, Marie, and thank you, Helen. It's a pleasure to be here today to present the results of the survey for 2022. And a huge thanks. I know it's already been given, but I need to do it as well for Douglas, who's done the majority of the work on the survey. So if Douglas could share the screen of the survey, and then the idea today is that Douglas and I will talk through some of the results, and if you want to go see the full report, there's a link there, and we can also send the slides through, which has the link after this seminar too. And I'll talk through the first couple of principles, and then Douglas will do the last 5 principles. Cool. Next slide, thanks. So just to kind of reiterate what the 7 principles are. So the first one is to establish a high level of corporate leadership for gender equality. Second one, to treat all women and men fairly at work, respect and support human rights and non-discrimination. And given all my work with the gender pay gap, etc., over the years, including current work we're doing for the Ministry for Women, that's one I value quite highly on my list. The third one is to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of all women and men workers. Fourth one is around education and training and professional development, which I think is really important, upskilling of staff in pathways for staff and individuals are really important. And we see that where you have in some ethnic groups in particular, certain blockages that happen across the progressional aspects of their career. Fifth one is implement enterprise development, supply chain, and marketing practices that empower women. Sixth one is around equality through community initiatives and advocacy, so sort of going beyond your organization. And the last one, which is kind of the second highest on my list in some ways, is around measuring and publicly reporting on progress to achieve gender equality. So it's about being really transparent. It's not just understanding your processes and quantifying your pay gaps and things like that, but then also being transparent internally and externally if possible, that shows that you have a real commitment to gender equality. In terms of an overview for the survey, there's 2 real main purposes behind the survey. So one is in terms of highlighting any trends, which we'll do throughout this presentation to see what's happening with particular principles and in particular questions we ask. And then the second aspect is more qualitative. So quite different to a lot of the work we do sometimes at the Institute in terms of using big data, but it's really, really important to get that qualitative information as to the context or the case studies and examples of how New Zealand organisations apply the principles. Because you might read, and this is what the report looks like if you're interested, but you might read the report and you're interested, you don't necessarily need to read the whole thing, but you might go, I need some ideas maybe on principle 4. And then you have a look at that particular section, and there's a lot of examples of what different organisations are doing on that principle, and then you can see if any of them are useful for your particular organisation and context. The survey this year was sent to all signatories. We have a continued focus that we started last year with additional questions focused on Māori and Pacific women. And we also have a continued focus this year. We were still asking extra questions related to COVID-19 to understand how that played a role for organisations. Like anything, there's some limitations and some caveats we need to put into place. So comparing across years is useful to a certain extent, but of course, remember there's different organizations that might be completing the survey each year, so it's not necessarily comparable from one year to the next. And so what I say usually in this front is we shouldn't focus on an annual change, so not necessarily the change from 2021 to 2022, but on the long-term trends. I think that should be the focus. That's where those kind of fluctuations in different organizations doing it get smoothed out. So the focus should be on kind of what those long-term trends are. Another limitation is, of course, selection bias. And what I mean by that is, of course, the organizations filling out the survey may not be necessarily representative of all organizations across New Zealand, because they're a group who have signed up in the first place to be a UN WEPS signatory. And then now that they're a signatory, have also then selected into doing the survey. So you have a select group of organizations who have chosen to do the survey, and they may not be representative of the wider set of organizations. It's just something to keep in mind. And of course, each year I always say this, we'd like more signatories to complete the survey. I think that would really help, because there's a good number that do complete it, but the more that completed, the more robust our information and the better our data to present as well. So first principle, women in leadership. So I'm just going to present a couple of things, and Douglas as well will do the same thing, where we present just a couple of aspects of each principle. So there's a lot more detail in the actual report. We've just chosen a few things within each principle. So this first one is around representation of women in terms of board of directors and the senior executive team. So you can see, for example, around board of directors, it's hovering around the same level, maybe a slight increase over time to about every 2 in every 5 in terms of board of directors. For the senior executive team, it's also been hovering around 40, and this year it was 50%. In terms of recruitment processes, and there's several aspects we ask around recruitment, unconscious bias training, whether there's women on the interview panel, any aspects of blockages in the selection process. We find a couple of things. So for unconscious bias training, that's around 3/4 of organizations that do that. It sort of bumped around in 2019. But apart from that, it's sort of been around the 75, late 60s. And in terms of reviewing profiles, it was up this year at 62, but prior to that was around the 40% of organization. And including females on interview panels, that seems to fluctuate quite a bit. So there might be quite specific to organizations. And apart from 2019, has generally been more than 50% of organizations include a female on the interview panel when it's a senior role. Some quotes from our case studies. So I'll read bits of them. I won't kind of read out all of them. But this one said, we openly communicate our support and commitment to the recruitment of women into leadership positions. We often utilize significant moments such as International Women's Day or the launch of our sustainability report. We also have clear measures that are presented as part of monthly reports to the organization. And these are just different things that they're doing on a regular basis at this organization as under the umbrella of activities and strategies that can contribute to women in leadership. In another example, and I quite like this one, in that they review university statistics on the proportion of male and female students to understand the pipeline of students coming through. and how this is represented in their hiring numbers. And then we review these figures over time to see if it's changing as well. And I know a number of public sector organizations in the past, I was quite pleased. One time, as an aside, when Treasury came and talked to me about what are the portion of students coming through with this kind of, with an economics background, and what's your male to female ratio, because we're not getting many female economists come through to the public sector. So it's good when they go back and look at what the tertiary education pipeline is. The second principle is around gender equality at work. And here we look at pay gaps, and being someone who likes the data, I highly appreciate organizations that quantify their pay gap. My own organization at AUT, after 20 years working here, they finally quantified our gender pay gap for the first time this year. We've still got a long way to go in that space. So in this survey, we looked at both the average pay gap and the median pay gap, and there are some differences there, which is probably due to a small sample size of the number of firms that we're looking at. And so you can see the average for both, and you can also see the lower quartile, median, and upper quartile, which just means what was the pay gap when we look at the bottom 25% of organizations in terms of the ones who had the smallest pay gap. You know, what was the pay gap like for those in the middle? And then what was the pay gap like for those of the top 25% who had the biggest pay gaps? And you can see those are obviously higher there. Next one, Douglas. Keep going. Okay, this one is around parental leave provision. We provide an additional payment over and above statutory paid leave to mothers or / primary caregivers. And it's been, you know, consistently over 50%, we were 69% this year in terms of providing that additional payment. And same for, cannot be said for, we provide additional leave over and above statutory paid leave to mothers, primary caregivers, probably partly because a lot of that may fall into the into other categories. But here it's generally been under 50%, except for last year, and kind of a number this year of 38% matches what we had in 2018 and 2019. Some quotes. One organization said, pay equity is reviewed annually as part of our annual REM process and reported to the REM and diversity committees and the board. And we're also currently considering participating with Mind the Gap. So that's a good plug for Mind the Gap. I don't know if the petition has closed, but they're still looking for more people to sign their petition. Next one. This one is around family-friendly policies during the COVID lockdown. So we host Christmas events, include gifts to all employees' children. We send care packages to families in isolation. We organize events through the social club. We've provided parenting workshops and paid work hours. And we support local charities such as Project Esther that helps families with support in crisis. So that's a good example that probably falls under both this principle and another one. So there can be some examples that fit under multiple principles. And then I pass on to Douglas. Thank you.
Yep, that works. Yeah, thank you, Gail, for giving us a great introduction to our study and for talking about the first two women's empowerment principles. So, Nisambulu Vinaka, I know Fijian Language Week was last week, but today, the 10th of October, is officially Fiji Day. Being from Fiji myself, I just wanted to quickly plug that so we can all have our own little celebration. Without further ado, Principle 3. So I'm sure we can all agree this is sort of something that has always been important in the workplace. but may not have received a lot of attention up until quite recently. And the health and well-being of every employee is sort of paramount to the success of an organization. He tangata, it is the people, right? So this implies that individuals, whānau, and communities are at the center of everything we do. And in this year's WEPS survey, it's great to see so many organizations implementing important health and well-being policies in their workplace. We're seeing a number of organizations implement zero tolerance harassment policies, protection and support for domestic violence victims, and other policies that serve in the best interest of employees' health and well-being. One of our survey measures is how organizations ensure the safety of employees after work hours. So we see that there is an increase in the proportion of organizations that have implemented initiatives to protect employees after work hours, such as escorts to employees' vehicle after hours, or providing rideshare credits or taxi vouchers after hours, which is up to 46% in both areas from 36 and 14% respectively in 2021. However, this number was hovering around 50% in 2019, so this year's numbers don't really match that or supersede that. Yeah, this is a response from one organization on their specific workplace protection and support policy with respect to domestic abuse victims. So quote, "We have a domestic violence policy, which we implemented in 2019. Employees affected by domestic abuse can access up to 10 days paid leave for medical appointments, legal appointments, and other activities related to domestic abuse. And we offer a range of additional support, such including the ability to change work contact details and flexibility in work." Principle 4, training and development. So, of course, this is not only super beneficial to an employee's career, this is also the best possible way to grow employee performance. So training either through formal programs or networking sessions or internal mentoring are all effective ways to give employees the necessary skills to perform tasks efficiently and to a high standard of quality, and also provide skills that can be applied in scenarios outside of the workplace. So this again is an area that has seen some great improvement in most areas since 2019. We have seen internal mentoring increase to 62% from 46% in 2019, while close to a half of organizations now run gender-specific networking groups, as well as encourage female leaders from their organizations to be external mentors for young women. However, the trend in these programs is also not so clear-cut, as these numbers have sort of not yet improved on the 2018 numbers. We kind of see that actually the proportion of organizations that implement such programs do tend to fluctuate through the years, which of course can come as a result of the limitations of our study, where the same organizations are not typically represented year to year. Regardless, when it comes to the same policies that focus specifically on Maori and or Pacifica women, we have seen massive drops in the proportion of organizations that implement such policies from 2018. So less than a fifth of organizations arrange internal mentoring of Maori and or Pacifica women, while less than a 10th run gender-specific networking sessions for Maori and or Pacifica women. Here is a quote from one organization on their specific formal development program. So we offer a major learning program that offers all colleagues the opportunity to gain a globally recognized qualification. And this qualification is valuable to all colleagues, not just during their time at our organization, but throughout their entire industry careers. We also have a career development pathway that provides our employees an opportunity to move through 9 accreditation levels. And we have the distinctive leadership program, which is our enterprise-wide leadership program. And we offer other talent development programs to build the capability and experience of our colleagues. We offer cultural intelligence training and run a Maori leadership program and our award-winning Maori leadership program. So I quite like this one because of the part of the quote that says, throughout their industry careers, which again shows that emphasis on he tangata, which is where the person is the most important thing. Here's a quote from one organization on how they schedule training programs. So this organization is aware that many employees are mothers or parents, and they may need that extra flexibility. So they state, we avoid scheduling in school holidays where possible, and always try to provide remote-in options for people unable to travel into the office. We often switch to full Zoom/Teams delivery to provide a more consistent experience for all people attending. So just that emphasis on flexibility around these training programs. Principle 5, marketing and supply. So I suppose by improving communication about your organization and building partnerships, this sort of allows your organization to become more focused on your customers and clients' needs. And by implementing policies that support the women's empowerment principles into your marketing and supply strategies, is sort of this spillover effect of WEPS support, WEPS, I mean women's empowerment support onto your suppliers and customers. And then it also creates a theme of gender equity, even among non-WEPS signatories, right? So in this year's survey, we have seen organizations operate a supplier diversity program where they support suppliers who have a diverse workforce. We have also seen organizations implement marketing guidelines that show responsible and dignified gender portrayal. And in our survey, we measured the proportion of organizations that evaluate gender-related barriers in accessing products and services. And these gender-related barriers will obviously differ on the nature of your organization, but they can include things like inadvertently blocking products to women, or sort of marketing from the perspective of one gender, or marketing that could lead to incorrect assumptions about a particular product or service. So we see an increase in the proportion of organizations who conduct customer research into gender-related barriers from 29% in 2021 to 31% in 2022. And this increase is even larger when you compare it to 2018 numbers, which was 21%. However, these two other methods have seen stark drops from 2021, with a proportion of organizations who review purchasing behaviors and review, analyze, and monitor customer feedback is at its lowest since 2019. When it comes to the portrayal of women in marketing, this organization adheres and supports specific advertising standards. So they, well, quote, we support and adhere strongly to Advertising Standard Authority's Responsible Marketing Code, and they have listed specific sections on gender and ethnicity within this marketing code. And the global organization took a global stance against hate speech on social media and paused all paid advertising on social platforms. And this organization took part in this locally and also supported that within a New Zealand context. But of course, since then, the pause has been lifted on all platforms apart from a couple. Likewise, when it comes to supplier diversity programs, this organization partners with suppliers that have a similar mission and vision to ensure that equity and diversity is sort of at the forefront of business operations. Quote, one of our key partnerships priorities is to partner with organizations that have similar values and mission as us, which is to put people first and promote equity, equal opportunities, and diversity in our industry. Principle 6, community leadership and engagement. So forming partnerships and becoming involved in the community, in community programs provides your organization with the perfect opportunity to become closer to and to help your community. And it is great to see that every single one of the organizations that participated in the WEPS survey collaborate or partner with women's organizations. And these include Pacific Inc., the National Council of Women, Zonta, YWCA, UN Women, Global Women, Diversity Works New Zealand, and Business and Professional Women, among many others. How organizations in the survey specifically supported community programs and women organizations was one of our measures in the survey. So overall, we've seen substantial increases in the proportion of organizations who provide charitable donations to women's organizations, as well as sponsor or fund women's initiatives, which has increased to 85% and 69% respectively from 21% in 2018. The proportion of organizations that provide external mentoring to women has increased to around the 30 to 40% bracket in the past couple of years, but this has decreased from 36% in 2021 to 31% this year. In last year's WEPS survey, we began measuring the same methods of support to Maori and or Pacifica women, and it's great to see improvement in all three methods. So the proportion of organizations who provide charitable donations to Maori and Pacific women's organizations has increased from 14% to 31%. Likewise, the sponsorship or funding to women's initiatives has increased from 14% to 23%, and external mentoring of Maori and or Pacifica women has increased from 14% to 46% from last year. This is a quote from, when asked what sort of support they specifically offer in this community, this particular organization responded by stating that they offer services free of charge to a number of organizations that support women. And that's just sort of more emphasis on collaboration in the community. The final principle is principle 7, and that's public reporting. So this allows WEPS signatories to yell their support of women's empowerment loud and proud to their employees, to their community, to the whānau, and to the world. It allows your organization to show that the workplace is one of equity and diversity, and also holds you accountable to that. So every single organization that responded to the survey communicates the involvement in women's empowerment principles to their employees, which is fantastic. And this comes in the form of actively supporting initiatives that relate to the women's empowerment principles, the proportion of organizations of which has increased to 69% from 61% in 2018. Whether they proudly include web support on their website, which has increased to 77% from 50% in 2018, and externally communicating WEPS information, which has increased from 43% in 2018 to 62%. But this remains about the same as in 2019, where the proportion of organizations that did this was about 64%. However, when it comes to reporting employment opportunity metrics, there have been declines in reporting the gender pay gap and the ethnic pay gap, as well as the motherhood penalty, which is where mothers encounter biological and cultural-based disadvantages in pay. So only 54% of organizations now report the gender pay gap, compared to 61% in 2018. Likewise, only 15% of organizations now report their ethnic pay gap, compared to 50% in 2018. And even more stark in contrast is the motherhood penalty, of which only 8% of organizations report, compared to 53% in 2018. So this doesn't necessarily imply a larger pay disparity in terms of gender or ethnicity or parental status, but reporting these statistics is very important, no matter how significant or insignificant they may be. And we do see that the average pay gap has decreased in principle 2 that Gail sort of mentioned, but it would still be great to see more organizations becoming transparent about these pay gaps. A few organizations have stated that they've committed to Mind the Gap. That's another plug for Mind the Gap, which is this campaign committed to reporting pay disparities across gender and ethnicity. So with more and more organizations continuously becoming involved in this campaign, we hope to see a more positive trend when it comes to reporting employment opportunity metrics in future WEPS surveys. Here is a quote from one organization when it comes to espousing the UN WEPS principles. Quote, "We refer to our commitment to the UN WEPS on our intranet, in tenders, pitches, and credentials documents, and we talk about it with our graduate applicants coming through and in our women and allies groups." So it's great that you're espousing the principles to sort of all relevant stakeholders, and you're showing your support for women's empowerment. Before I sum up, overall we've seen a lot of positive trends and maybe some not so positive trends when it comes to applying the women's empowerment principles in the workplace, but it's not so clear cut, and this of course comes as a result of the limitations of the study And in future, we hope to see more signatories participate in the survey so that we can get a clearer understanding of the direction that New Zealand organizations are heading in. And then this could potentially inform our policy, for example, that actively supports and improves women's empowerment in the workplace. Winaka waka for listening to our presentation today. You can read, of course, the full report on our website. So I've listed that on this slide here. And yeah, as Gail mentioned, this sort of serves as a case study that you can use to implement women's empowerment principles in your organization in future. Thank you.
Look, thank you so much, Gail and Douglas, for taking us through the 7 principles and the survey and the results of them, and sharing the insights and breaking it down for us. And as you've said, there are some interesting trends there in the statistics that you've delivered there. And a question for you, Gail, before I open it up to the panel or the group of people that are participating. So for those that are participating in this webinar, you're more than welcome to put any questions to Gail or Douglas through the Q&A section. Please, one of our administrator, Maddie, will be keeping an eye on any of those questions that are coming through, as well as myself. So please don't hesitate to put any questions to Gail or Douglas, and I look forward to taking and fielding those questions and passing them on. But interesting to you, Gail, interesting with regard to the stats and the trends that have come through from 2018 to now. And one of the things that I found really heartening, and you did allude to it, is that now more businesses or in the private sector are starting to look at the pipeline of what's happening in the tertiary institutes, which, I know that we're trying to promote in that secondary education space, particularly for women, to go into some of those engineering, those not so much mainstream jobs. Are you finding that with the research that you're doing across many of the MB Ministry for Women, is that coming through there in any of their studies that they're using that as a facility?
I haven't seen it come through a whole lot, to be honest. I mean, it's a constant thing we talk about, even with my other hat on at the Productivity Commission, that sometimes there isn't enough of an interface between industry and the education sector. Something that should help that in some ways is with the establishment of the workforce development councils that we now have. That's supposed to potentially help that interface in terms of not just in terms of looking at the pipeline, but also then contributing back to the education sector in terms of what skills are required at the industry level, and ensuring that the pipeline coming through has the right skills, as well as diversity in that pipeline as well. So I think that should be, you would expect as the workforce development councils improve, they've only just started going in that space, so that we should get a lot more interface then.
And I would actually support that, because I think sometimes we work in silos, don't we, Gail? And it's actually that sharing of information. It can be actually enhance any of the skill shortages that we've got, particularly when it comes to resourcing in the different industries. Because with the different companies and entities that have done the survey, it's quite diverse, isn't it? From the banking to those that are in the building industry, and just seeing the cross-section of the answers that they put. So, Gail, the other thing that I found we were maintaining, but I'd like to see us increase, is the ability of more women to be on the interview panel. So is that because we're still waiting for that pipeline to feed through more women in that leadership role? Or,
that's possibly true, because if there isn't enough capacity there, then it's hard to, and I do find that myself, if I use my own example at university, when I became a professor a number of years ago, I suddenly get invited. The other thing is it puts a huge burden on the few women that are there, right? Because then I was suddenly invited to be on lots of university panels, because if the requirement is they need a female professor and there's not many female professors around, then then there's extra burden on the few female professors there are to meet that requirement of having a female on every panel. So we have to look at it from both sides as well sometimes. That I think, yeah, one might be a capacity issue, and then two, recognize the extra burden that are then placed on the few women that are there and able to do it. You know, it depends on the size of the organization, of course, but that's probably part of the story.
And that kind of feathers into, Gail, into the mentoring of other women or younger women coming into the organisation, and you know, giving them the confidence, I suppose, to elevate or climb that ladder. So I see that, because it's quite right, the burden on the few that are at that level is quite time consuming. But if we can see the pipeline with the mentoring. So with regard to the survey and the people that were actually mentoring younger people within the organisation, it was good to see that grow. But I thought that the external mentoring of other young women was something. So do we put that down to maybe a COVID lens over what's happened with some of the dives that we've had in the results, knowing that, you know, people are just starting to come back to the workplace? Whilst the figures were really good with the community engagement and looking after the people, they were doing a lot of work in that space. But I was just thinking, could we attribute some of those declines?
But I mean, that might be it. I'll pass to Douglas in a minute to see if he's got any additional thoughts. But I guess, yeah, COVID could still be playing, because I know there's still a number of organizations, and it comes through in some of the results that, you know, there's still COVID fatigue. You know, it might have been a year since our lockdown in Auckland, but there's still a lot of people who talk about that lockdown, and there's still a lot of COVID fatigue affecting businesses. But Douglas, do you have any other thoughts on what might be affecting some of those mentoring numbers?
No, not particularly, but yeah, as you mentioned, obviously there's quite a bit of COVID fatigue, but obviously our study just sort of reports the numbers, but we can't really make inference on what's been causing it or anything like that.
No, and I agree. It's just that when I looked at it, because I love the fact that it is a benchmark for the businesses that have been with us since we've been doing this. And I see that there is a natural growth with some of them where they focus on a particular principle. And I'm sure you would have seen that too, Gail, in that you see that they've almost implemented everything in principle one at the high level corporate, and then they go to the next principle and invest an awful lot of time in that to make sure that they're looking at their strategies and policies. And when I talk about their strategies and policies, it's really wonderful to see that more of them are starting to have that diversity and inclusion around the multicultural aspect of who they're employing. Did you see that come through stronger in the results, Gail or Douglas?
I mean, it does come through in some of the results for when we look at some of the questions around asking the same question for in terms of their focus with Māori and Pacifica. So that comes through, although there's still very few organizations who are doing it, but at least there is some focus in that space now, which in the past there was no focus, right? So it's now being recognized, and part of it will depend on the size of the organization. So one thing we can also think about maybe in the future is maybe it's worth reporting some of those stats by organization size, just to see, because if you're in a very small organization and you know, maybe you don't, maybe only one person in your organization is Māori or Pacific, then you may not have particular policies and principles, etc. So it might be interesting to see some of these stats by organization size. What do you think, Douglas?
Yeah, I think, that's definitely true, but it's also something we've sort of taken away from the survey. We've kind of like stopped the focus or dependent on organizational size. I mean, we do ask the question like what your organizational size is, but we actually don't make any different sort of categories in terms of, you know, answering the particular questions in terms
it does come through in the awards night where they are looked at differently in terms of the awards, right? But in the reporting, because we've got this is another plug for wanting more organizations to do the survey, right? Because we don't have enough really to split it by organization size. If we get more as signatories complete the survey over time, then we'll be able to do that disaggregation where we can see, and I think it would be really interesting to see some of those results, especially by ethnicity and things, by organization size.
No, I agree. And so I've got a question that's just come in, Gail, and it says, I'm interested to learn how companies could measure the motherhood penalty.
Oh, it's a good question.
It is a good question.
I can't remember now. I know Stats New Zealand has put out a lot of material on how organizations can measure the gender pay gap, but I don't believe they've put anything out in terms of looking at the motherhood penalty. But in the simplistic way of doing it is where you kind of compare. You've got to have a reasonable size organization, and where you compare people within the same level, women with children, without children, to sort of look at what the motherhood penalty is. That's what it's trying to capture. Another comparison is where you look at within the same kind of rank level, women with children versus men with children. Now, the difficulty with doing this, and there is, one snag in terms of measuring the motherhood penalty, is you don't always have this information in your HR systems within the organization, right? Yes. And it's difficult information to also collect in terms of whether the individual has a child or not. So it is something that can be a little bit tricky to derive if you don't have that information.
Right. What I've found, just talking with some of the signatories and supporters that I engage with, is that because that question is in there, they're starting to look at how do they measure that, because they're starting to see that actually with that parental penalty, because it affects both men and women, and it is about a health and safe environment for all, that they're actually starting to look at those figures. So hopefully, as we continue down this journey, we'll get a little bit more data around it.
And I think in the meantime, the things to sort of measure as well are kind of the return to work pathways and the progression as well. I know some organizations, that I've talked to in the past, they were implementing particular policies around helping women return to work after parental leave. And it was mostly women who were taking up the parental leave. There are still very few men that take up the parental leave provisions, but they were implementing new policies, and one way I suggested that they measure some of the impact of those policies is to really follow, how long is it before they return back, follow their progression once they return back. Are there any, to spot if there's any particular blockages that occur when they return back? And that's something else that you can do to assess the motherhood penalty from a different perspective with data that you do have.
Right. I can just see that our person who coordinates the survey frantically doing some writing there, Marie, and I'm just wondering if she's taking down some of these notes, because I think the really good points that we need to be aware of, particularly when we're painting the picture of the landscape of what it's like for women and men, and is it a safe environment, and that gender pay gap around all ethnicities is really crucial. So, Gail, with all of the things that are happening at the moment, there is legislation coming through around pay transparency, around the ethnic pay gap for Māori and Pacifica. Do you think with all of these things being spoken about more openly now, that you will see a change of direction of more inclusive policies and strategies and more accountability going forward in many of the industries?
I certainly hope so. I do think something that kind of, I didn't used to necessarily always agree with this, but I do think something that forces organizations in some ways to be transparent without it being too burdensome is really useful, because I mean, a lot of these things we've known for a long time. We know there's we've known there's gender pay gap for a long time. We know there's ethnic pay gaps. We've known that for a long time. You know, yes, we have more data on it now, and yes, we're talking about it more now, but we could equally be talking about it still 10 years from now, 20 years from now. But if you have something that forces organizations to be transparent and have to report on it, then that gets a bit more action moving. It is at least my general belief. So I think if that particular pathway allows for more transparency, then I think then we will see more action.
So Gail, with regard to the reporting, and there is a perception that the survey that go out, we have a number of signatories that are very committed to do it because they use it as an internal benchmark, and they do see the value in doing this, and they refer back to previous years of how they're tracking and what they're doing. So would you think that it would be worth us looking at a pre-webinar prior to the survey going out to the signatories and supporters to give them some insight of not so much the importance of it, but we know what's measured, you know, gets done, and to encourage them to actually participate and show them how they can use the data that is relevant and come back, and how they can actually implement that into their strategies.
Yeah, even you could even do a pre-webinar prior to us sending the survey out, where we also get feedback on any, you know, we don't want to make the survey too long, because that makes it more burdensome. But it might be, I think it would be good to get more feedback on what types of questions people would like, what questions they do like at the moment. You know, you have the core questions, but there's also an additional layer of questions that, you know, maybe possible if you know, if there's a lot of organizations that want to see those kinds of questions, or maybe there's specific questions that are suited, extra questions that are suited to small organizations, and maybe those organizations that are under a certain size go off and answer an extra set of questions or something. So yeah, a pre-webinar where we also get input and, you know, almost some co-design from organizations would potentially be quite useful, I think.
And I think you're right, because, you know, whilst it's good to have a measure, and a number of our signatories have been working through the 7 principles and using it as a gateway, the landscape of working post-COVID has certainly changed the way that we work, our perception of what is a good working environment now. So I think it would be quite timely, I agree with you, to do something like that, and to have that two-way dialogue as to what it is that they would like to measure and that. So I'm just looking at the time, and we've had a comment come through, Gail, saying, thank you so much for you and Douglas for the survey result and the webinar. They found it really insightful, and that they got a lot out of the presentation. So I think doing it this way and moving the way that we've done it, Gail and Douglas, has been way more informative than giving you 15 minutes on the night of the White Camellia Awards trying to unpack and analyze this information. You know, it just is way more insightful doing it this way. So I'm going to take the opportunity to kind of wind us up and thank you, Gail, Professor Gail Pacheco, for all the work that you do. The partnership that we have with you and the New Zealand Work Research Institute is just amazing, and your young students, master's students that help you through this. It was a pleasure working with Summer last year, and it's been a pleasure working with Douglas this year. Is just so insightful for our businesses, and without the independence and the validity that you and the organisation give the survey, it certainly puts it in high regard. And I know that our signatories and supporters are able to go to their CEOs and say, look, you know, what gets measured gets done. It's been done in a credible way. the surveys are up on the website for everybody to have a look and to use them as a reference point. So I just want to thank you both again. Look forward to working with you next year, and hopefully that you'd have some capacity to do that conversation or dialogue about, do we need to look at changing some of our questions, and what would those questions look like? Because I think you're right, just keeping adding questions into a survey is just making it longer and longer, and people just don't have, we're all time poor, aren't
No,
we?
no one's got the time. Can I add one thing? Thank you to both of you, and also plug to go and look at this, the report. And if you don't have time to look at the report, Douglas has done an amazing 4-page summary of the report with the key stats and information, and that's just 4 pages to go look at. So it's at the same link that Douglas put up earlier.
Douglas, would you like to put that link up again, please, just for those that are participant that might be able to do that, if you could share that last slide?
Yep, sure, no worries.
Thank you. And while we're waiting for Douglas to do that, once again, the Women's Empowerment Principles is delivered to you under the auspice of UN Women Aotearoa New Zealand, Business and Professional Women, Zonta 16, District 16, and also the Human Rights Commission. It's our absolute pleasure to support our signatories and supporters. We hope that you've taken away from this some insights. We're looking in the new year to do more brown paper bag lunches and roundtables. We will keep you posted. Maddie, our administrator, does an amazing job with a regular MailChimp to everybody. And if you're not there, please get in touch with admin@weps.co.nz to make sure that you're on that. So once again, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you, Douglas and Gail, for all your input. Mā te wā.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.